right.
By about 1975, I reached a point in my experience with radio when I simply got tired of it. I suppose I began to get bored with the rock music shtick. I was beginning to get tired of the gypsy lifestyle, and I knew I wasn't going to get rich doing it. Or maybe I was just getting too old for this gig and I wanted to change. Before I seriously entered into the world of talk radio as one of transitions, I was constantly in search of something more than just an average job. So I spent a lot of my life picking up one job, growing bored, finding another, and so forth. As I've said, I love electronics. I love technical stuff. I'm intrigued by how things work. I love the challenge of fixing electronic and technical things after 20 years of intellectually non-challenging rock radio and its inherently gypsy-like existence. I really needed something different, challenging, perhaps more secure. So I took this technical job at Cox Cable in San Diego. 3 years later, I took a technical job at Times Mir in Las Vegas. My work at Times Mir was actually exciting at first. We had to basically build an entire cable system, head end, that's the place where all the signals come from scratch. Very exciting. Then I installed the satellite gear, the processing and microwave links, all the other equipment for the cable system. Then after building it, I maintained it. I kept the job for about 5 years. I had an entire department under me. But then I became kind of like the Maytag repairman, and boredom set in and overwhelmed me. My wife at the time, Kim, did not share my philosophy about work. As far as she was concerned, I should be content with a secure, well-paying job in a big multinational company. Maybe she was just more practical than I am. She wanted me to make good money, have regular hours, dedicate my life to her and our family when I was not working. Well, wasn't me. I can't stay with anything very long if it doesn't excite me, if it doesn't in some way. Well, I get to a point in my life where I needed some intellectual stimulation, and I needed to do something for which I had a genuine interest or curiosity. Some would call that selfishness. Others will, for the rest of their life, do the same 9-to-5 job they hate. I couldn't do it. Just sitting around collecting a check was not for me. Kim did not understand at all my thinking on that. It was about that time that I was whiling away my life at Times Mir. Word got out to the infamous Claire Reese, program director of KDWN Las Vegas. KDWN is a huge, clear channel, 50,000-watt radio station. With its strong signal, KDON has an impressive broadcast range, reaches up to about 150 miles about Las Vegas. At night, KDON is an altogether different radio station. Radio signals, you see, behave somewhat differently. They begin bouncing off the ionosphere, and they can broadcast a lot farther, particularly when you've got a very strong signal to start with, as is the case with KDWN. At night, their signal went to 12 western states. Now, obviously, with this kind of broadcast range at night, it's got a tremendous opportunity to reach more people than just Las Vegas and the highway from Los Angeles. Apparently, Claire had heard that I had a lot of years of radio under my belt with a certain amount of experience in talk. In essence, KDON found me. I didn't even know they were looking for anybody. Claire Reese was very clever in her approach, inviting me to do some part-time work for KDON. Wouldn't you like to work on radio again? At least part-time? We could sure use the help, she said. She appealed to my deepest instincts and desires, and I did not and could not resist. Sure, said I. And that was that. So one day, they put me in with another talk show host on a Saturday show just to see how I would do. Normally, I do not like working with anybody else. I prefer working alone on the air. Well, for one thing, with two radio hosts, there is a tendency for one to dominate the other, or possibly two will begin to argue. Or if there is a caller on the line who's on the air, both may give the impression of ganging up on the caller and so forth. In this case, I got along very well with this particular host. His name was Jack Daniels, like the whiskey. To this day, Jack remains one of my dear friends. After this initial show, as my audition, Claire came to me in the studio, said, "Well, you did pretty well. Want to do a little more?" I was immediately offered a part-time weekend shift as part of a two-man talk show, and I gladly accepted. I must say, I had a great time, a lot of fun. Alas, that same old black magic of radio put its spell back upon me, and there I was hooked all over again. All the while I continued to work at Times Mirror during the week, working a regular 5-day week. Eventually I was offered a midday talk show to be aired every week, co-hosting with Jack Daniels from 10 a.m. in the morning till 2 in the afternoon. Well, this meant I had to work 12 hours every day of the regular work week. Turned out to be grueling. Somehow I managed to work like that for about a half year, but it finally got to the point of physical exhaustion. Just as I was at my physical and mental limits after 6 months of this madness, Times Mirror management came to me and gave me an ultimatum. They said I had to make a choice. I had to choose to go to KDON or to manage the technical department I had developed and ran for 5 years. And climb the corporate ladder, and they held out all kinds of candy. I told them I'd think about it, and I thought about it. I thought about it until I thought I'd get sick. So I went to Claire Reese. Claire wanted me to work for KWN exclusively. She made me an offer, but unfortunately her offer was about $8,000 less than I was making at Times Mirror. This was a big decision at this point in my life. What do? Leave a perfectly good, secure, well-paying job for a radio job that paid much less and was not necessarily very secure? After meeting with Claire, I went home to talk to my wife. Now, Kim thought I was absolutely, completely out of my mind. To her, there was no alternative to Times Mirror. Nonetheless, in the end, I went with my first love, radio. So, there I was again, back in full-time radio. To start, I continued the show co-hosted with Jack Daniels from 10 in the morning till 2 in the afternoon. I also did the necessary production work, including commercials and whatever else needed to be done, for several months. Now, after a few months, I began to dream about doing a show at night. Believe me, I was very aware of how powerful a station KDON was, how widely it was broadcast at night. I wanted to reach more people. Yep, I was ambitious, as always, and I wanted to take advantage of the nighttime opportunity, so I told Claire I wanted a chance to do the show at night. She listened carefully. She nodded and said, "We'll see." And that was that. Claire Reese is one of the more unusual people I've ever known in my whole life. This is a person I would grow to love and hate at the same time. I love her because I guess she's a mentor of mine. She is at once one of the most professional, intelligent, hard-bitten business people I've ever known. Straight out, Claire Reese is every inch a radio person. She possesses an unbelievable amount of knowledge and experience about the business of radio, yet, at times, Claire Reese is also as mad as a hatter. And I've told her that. And she's admitted that to me. Over the course of the years I worked at KDON, Claire fired me, I think about a half-dozen times. She'd probably acknowledge many of the instances when she fired me, but she'd probably deny many more of them. I think it's safe to say my relationship with Claire Reese was a love-hate relationship. And I'm sure it's on both sides. I'm sure there were times when Claire Reese hated my guts. But she recognized that I did have talent right from the very beginning, and for that she loved me. Well, there was a 5-hour show from 1 to 6 a.m. every day, hosted by an older man, and I'll just call him Hank Brandon, not his real name. Hank had been in broadcasting for a lot of years, spending many years doing this show, but Hank was beginning to slow down, consider retirement. So there was a chance that eventually, if I hung around long enough, I figured I could get a shot at taking over that show. Hank obviously could care less about the program, didn't see the potential I saw. He had several lines to receive calls, but he would either neglect callers altogether, or would do a show a long time before he even got to callers, or more likely wouldn't get them at all. Usually on any given night, Hank would sort of sit in front of the mic, take out the local newspaper, and begin reading from it. He would literally read each article as it appeared in the paper. Sometimes you could actually hear the newspaper pages rustling as he would proceed through it. Matter of fact, if you listened all night long, you would hear, before you were done, just about every article in the Las Vegas paper. Nothing could be more boring, and it was no surprise the program was not very popular. Obviously, there had to be change there, and I was willing to bet that Claire recognized that. Well, she did. One day I got a break. It turned out Hank got sick. It happens. Couldn't come in to do the show. Claire came and told me, "Here's my big chance." Warned me if I did a lousy job, the big hook in broadcasting or showbiz would come out and I'd be yanked right out of there. Well, I thanked her profusely, was very excited at the opportunity to do my own live all-night talk show. So began my first pre-talk show panic attack. I wanted desperately to do a good job. I wanted it to work more than anything. But now, before the show, the heart began to pound, breathing became difficult, I began to sweat profusely, I was shaking, I smoked one cig after the other just to survive. Then finally at 1 a.m. it was my turn to go on the air. By this time, I was soaked from perspiration and nervous as hell. I'm certain I sounded very, very nervous and scared on the air. I began the show amidst my panic attack, but somehow kept going. I think the only thing that had a way of soothing me, encouraging me, was listener response. Poor Hank Brandon would not only drone on, but frequently never even bothered to solicit listeners to call. You've got to ask people to call, or they don't. And when he did, sometimes he wouldn't get a call for an hour. I made every effort to be well prepared, spent about 4 or 5 hours at it, and so when I went on the air, I just began discussing topics of interest at the time. I was ready for anything. And the moment I invited listeners to call, the phone bank lit up like a Christmas tree. The phones were jammed with callers throughout the night. I had a blast. Claire Reese was pleased. She never got too excited about anything. 2 weeks passed after my first shot at doing the all-night show. Then I had another chance. Again, I was well prepared for the show. I talked about what was of interest at the time, and again the phone bank lit up like a Christmas tree. Well, that's what did the trick for me, and that's when the change occurred. Claire now knew she had a hit on her hands with me. Poor Hank was shifted to do the day show, and I got to do the night show. That was the beginning of a show called West Coast AM. Now, there are a whole bunch of interesting stories about West Coast AM from when we first began. For one thing, at that time, KDON was located at the Las Vegas Plaza Hotel, actually now Jackie Gaughan's Plaza Hotel. And as part of a trade-off for advertising the hotel on the air, the Plaza provided the toll-free 800 number that was used on the air during my show. For years, when Hank gave out the 800 number on a show, well, frankly, he didn't get many calls, so it wasn't used. On average, the 800 number phone bill was maybe $100 a month. The Plaza Hotel didn't think anything about paying it. But after I was on the air for 1 month, they got the bill. Only this time, it was for $12,000. Well, the Plaza Hotel management went through the roof. Needless to say, they immediately pulled the 800 number. KDON had to get its own to accommodate all the calls I was getting, and there were plenty of them. So I commuted the 130-mile round trip between Pahrump and KDON in Las Vegas. I always carried with me a thermos of coffee. It was back, you'll recall, when thermos bottles were made with glass containers inside and a metallic or plastic sheath outside. One day I was sitting in the studio at about 2 or 3 in the morning drinking coffee as usual, After drinking about half of the coffee, I looked into my cup. I had dropped my thermos bottle earlier and hadn't bothered to check it. So I looked into my cup, and there, floating around in my coffee, was what seemed to be 1,000,000 pieces of ground glass. I reached over and I shook the thermos bottle, and then I could hear it. I could hear all the glass bouncing around. Well, in my mind, I suddenly figured out, I was on the air. I figured out I had been drinking ground glass for the last 2 hours. I panicked, right on the air. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've been drinking ground glass for the last 2 hours," I said. People began calling me and saying, "Quick, get off the air, get to a hospital." They had emergency medical teams showing up at the Plaza Hotel. It was awful. I refused to leave. People were calling me and advising me about what to do. One guy called up and said, "I can save your life, Art. You need to immediately eat a half loaf of bread," at least a half a loaf. I guess the assumption was the bread would go into my stomach, absorb the broken glass, and then pass harmlessly through my system. Well, I was ready to do anything. Someone ran up to the radio station, left a loaf of bread outside the door. I ran out during a commercial, got it, ran back into the studio, and ran 3 consecutive minutes of commercials. In 3 minutes, I actually downed an entire half loaf of bread. It was the ugliest thing you ever saw. I was stuffing pieces of bread into my mouth a mile a minute. I came back on the air, bloated with coffee, and now the bread expanding in my belly, and I had the worst bellyache I ever had in my whole life. Even thought I was dying. I stayed on the air until the bitter end. People were telling me it was the end. They were calling up and saying goodbye. It was really pathetic. And I'm sure a lot of you long-time listeners may remember that. Anyway, after I got off the air, I looked very carefully and found that, yes, the thermos bottle had indeed broken. However, the glass had stayed inside the area between the glass and the outside of the container. What I was actually drinking were little paint chips that had coated the glass. I did the West Coast show for more than a decade. And over the years, the show always ranked #1 on the West Coast as an all-night talk show. I was, and I still am, one of the only very successful radio talk show hosts to do unscreened live talk radio. I don't screen calls, I receive. Now, that means I never know what's coming up next. I just press the next blinking light and somebody goes on the air. That's part of my philosophy, trying to do it this way. I take a risk doing it, but it makes it interesting, spontaneous. I handle everything as it comes along. Usually, I don't even limit the topic of discussion. Somebody calls and wants to talk about a particular topic, that's what we do. I've made it my policy that something useful can be derived from just about any call. And unlike some talk show hosts, I don't need to talk only to people who happen to agree with me on something. Everybody is welcome to call. I know myself, if I didn't operate this way, I'd get bored. And I never would have stayed with it as long as I have. Now, despite all the success that West Coast AM was having, Claire Reese still found reasons to fire me. Many times. The last most memorable example was after I had just flown to Paris. I went to France on the Concorde and returned from that trip, only not on the Concorde. It took 15 hours. And so I got home dog-tired. And I called Claire up and said, "Claire, I've got terrible jet lag." She wanted me to come in that night. I said, "No, Claire, I can't do it. I need 1 day." She said, "Okay, well then just don't bother coming in at all." She hung the phone up in my ear. She wasn't joking. She was quite earnest when she said this. 3 hours later, she called back, said, "All right, you're not fired. Skip tonight, come in tomorrow. And either I'll find someone for tonight or I'll shut the station down altogether." She would always say that. Actually, her exact words were, "I'll shut the son of a bitch off." And she occasionally did. She was often melodramatic, frequently threatened to shut down the station. It was, of course, ridiculous, but she would do it. No, finally I said, I'll come in, so I went. Claire Reese was a screamer. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the day to her voice screaming on my answering machine. She'd yell and scream about something I'd done or thought that I had done. She had a personality that could piss off the Pope. She had a taskmaster way about her. She'd sit at her desk, look over her glasses on the bridge of her nose, and give you the meanest look you've ever seen in your whole life. Usually, the look was delivered along with a tirade of words that would make a sailor blush. There had been occasions when I'd sit in her office, and she'd use every name in the book to address me. She'd scream, she'd yell, I'd quiver and be appropriately scared and frightened. Eventually, after enough years of it, I began to realize that I didn't have to take this kind of treatment. It was it's a very old way of managing by intimidation, and so I began yelling back. This in turn resulted in a number of pitched, screaming, and yelling battles. I matched her decibel for decibel and word for word. This in turn resulted in my being fired, even more times. Claire Reese does not like being corrected or challenged in any way. She's a queen, a ruler, and you just don't do that sort of thing, but I did it. Oddly enough, she respected my talent, and I respected her leadership. One day, long after West Coast AM had proven itself a popular show, I went into her office and explained that I desperately needed a raise. You see, up until then, I was going along, just sort of eking out a living as best I could on the salary. It really wasn't enough. I was aware that despite the popularity of the show didn't make a lot of money. For some reason, the sales department of KDON didn't even try to sell the show. As far as I was concerned, West Coast AM was definitely a marketable commodity, and as a matter of fact, prime for syndication. Anyway, I went into Claire's office, tried to get the raise that I not only thought I deserved, but desperately needed. She said, no, can't do it. I was dumbfounded. I couldn't believe it. Well, if you can't do it, I said steadily, trying to maintain my composure, I can't continue. Fine, she said, then don't. In this instance, I quit, and she fired me at about the same time. In a sense, we were at yet another standoff. This is a very famous time in my experience with KWN that many of my long listeners will recall. They will remember when I did not come on the air. And some may even remember how long I quit KDON, which I believe was about 4 months. This was a long time. Crazy thing about it is, I ended up working for another radio station in Las Vegas for much more money. Didn't even do a show. I engineered. In fact, I stayed off the air during that 4 months, that hiatus, and engineered. In the meantime, Claire Reese kept West Coast AM on the air, but she used a couple of other talk show hosts in an attempt to make it work. Well, it didn't. Unfortunately for her, my replacements couldn't do the kind of job I did. I would say they failed miserably. And for the entire period I was away, KDON constantly got calls from listeners asking about my whereabouts. Where'd Art go, they wanted to know. I'm happy to say the show was awful. I'm certain Claire Reese knew it. No doubt her pride prevented her from asking me to come back. I tried to hold out long as I could, but eventually I gave in. The engineering stuff wore on me. I do it easily, but it bores me. So I tried calling Claire to ask her for my job back. She ignored my calls, wouldn't take them. After a few days, I called her, and finally she answered. When I asked for my job back, she declined to let me have it. Her pride was just too great. I'd not be put off, so I kept calling her. Every time she got back on the phone, I told her, I want to get back on, I know I made a mistake. I groveled, I wanted to get back on. No, she would say. I continued to call her every day. Would she ever admit she made a mistake? No. So I swallowed my pride and told her I made a mistake. It's true. I gave her an ultimatum, and I should never have done that. She doesn't like ultimatums, never responds favorably to them, and I knew it. I explained to her I never should have left. I groveled. Finally, she called me and said, "All right, damn it, come back." And so back I came. I continued doing the show, West Coast AM. This time I did the show 6 nights a week. That was a total of 30 air hours a week. I kept it up for the next 2 or 3 years, very successfully, achieving the highest ratings and so forth and so on. Phone lines always packed every night. Show was as popular as it could be. Now, I lived in Pahrump at that time, which meant I had to drive 65 miles to Las Vegas one way and the same amount back home 6 days a week. Now, all this airtime, all the driving, was a little much. I realized it couldn't go on indefinitely and have me survive. So, again, there I am, standing before Claire Reese. "Claire," I said, "I can't operate like this anymore. I need to cut my airtime back to 5 days a week," I said wearily. "I need a bit of my life back." Somehow I managed to avoid getting fired over this and was actually able to cut back to a 5-day week. It was still a lot of commuting. Nonetheless, eventually I did manage to get fired again despite my success. This time not by Claire, but by the elderly, eccentric, lovable millionaire who still owns the station. We'll call him Bob Blanche. I believe he's well into his 80s now. In those days, Mr. Blanche owned a number of radio and TV stations. Anyway, he just happened to drop by KDON one day and called me into his office. "Art," he said, "I've decided that we need to cancel the news." I looked at him confused. For 5 minutes at the top of every hour, remember I do 5 hours now, we had the Associated Press News. No one cancels the news. It's part of what you do. I mean, it generates the interest that you do in the show. It keeps you up on current events. Besides, frankly, a person who does a 5-hour talk show needs about 5 minutes to be able to run and take care of business. So I said, "Sir, you cannot drop the news." And I said it respectfully. "Yes, I can." He responded, "Well, wait a minute," I said, fretting. "I've got to go to the men's room. And the only time I can do that is during the news at the top of the hour. You can't cancel the news." "Yes, I can," he said. "I own this station, and if I want to drop the news, it's going to be dropped." And so I sat there all dejected and finally said, "Well, if you cancel the news, then you'll have to fire me." "Okay," he said, "then you're fired." "Okay," I said, and began to walk out the door. He said, wait a minute, "Okay, you're not fired." In the end, he listened to reason, and we didn't cancel the news. But it was an awfully strange encounter with this man, who I hardly ever saw. Yet he was behind my success and was literally the one who fed me. Overall, my experience at KDON was a rocky, lovable time that I'll never forget. Moreover, it really is where I got my big start in talk radio, and for that I'll always be indebted to the people at KDON, especially Claire Reese. Sometimes, as I reflect on my experience at KDON, I compare it to my experience at boot camp when I enlisted in the Air Force. Very much alike, actually. Claire Reese was the get-in-your-face kind of drill sergeant who drilled and pounded into me what I needed to know for my career. Of course, KDON became more than just basic training because I learned more than just the basics to succeed. One good example of what I learned from Claire Reese was that I should always err on the side of caution, that I should avoid putting something on the air which could get me sued or get the station sued. This was very good advice, especially these days. We are, after all, very a litigating society, aren't we? For this advice and direction, and a whole lot of other good advice and direction, I really owe Claire a lot. She may feel what I have said here is not true or is too critical, but it is true. I've only related the facts as they are from my perspective. At any rate, I respect Claire Reese immensely, no matter what she has done to me in the past or does in the future. And as a matter of fact, I predicted in my written book, and I now will tell you that prophecy has been fulfilled because I no longer have KWN as an affiliate. After we left and began the syndication, I asked Kate on to carry the whole show, and again, stubborn pride prevented them from doing that. They wouldn't carry any more of it but about 3 hours, and we tried and tried and tried for about a year, and finally moved to KVEG 840 in Las Vegas, and thankfully they carry the entire program beginning to end. But my prophetic statement in the book turned out to be true.